was Bush, it was Obama, it's Trump, be someone else next, but the same agenda will unfold. Unless we stop it, which we can.
How would you recommend going about stopping it?
Well, overwhelmingly, what I've just been talking about. There's a number of things. The key one is to get informed and stop seeing everything in terms of dots and start to see a picture. There are two techniques of mass perception manipulation. One I call problem, reaction, solution. And that is where you create a problem or the perception of one. You tell the public through this unquestioning, pathetic media the version of that problem you want them to believe. And then you want the public to react at stage two. You created the problem, reaction at stage two. Do something. This can't go on. So at stage three, you can offer the solution, which is to change things in the way that you always wanted to change them all along. But without the manufactured problem, you would not have an excuse to change. So if you had harmony in the Middle East, and everyone was getting on, you ain't got a problem. So you can't offer a solution to it which transforms the Middle East. So what you do is you create one. You say that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. It's not even a real problem. It's a made-up one. So you've got your problem. You say to people, oh, it's terrible, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons. Oh, he's a threat to us all. Oh, do something. Oh, okay, we'll invade Iraq and find no weapons of mass destruction. And then you say to people, oh, Gaddafi, he's killing his own people. Because Hitler always comes out. He's the new Hitler. Oh, well, we better send the boys in then and turn Libya into a catastrophe. We want to get rid of Assad. Okay, so you start demonizing him. Oh, Assad's the new Hitler. Oh, I thought Gaddafi was. Oh, he's Hitler as well. And so it goes on. And so if we get streetwise to these things, then we stop falling for them, both in terms of physically taking part in these divide and rule conflicts, but also from the Western public's point of view, stop supporting them because you're seeing what's really happening. The problems are being created on purpose to justify the solution that changes society. The other mass mind manipulation technique that goes along with problem, reaction, solution is what I call the totalitarian tiptoe, where you start at A and you know you're going to Z, but you don't want people to realize that there is an agenda here and there's an end goal. You want people to believe that all the steps from A to Z are all random events, none of them connected to any of the others. So you want them to see Libya in isolation. You want them to see Syria in isolation, Afghanistan and Iraq. You want to see them all in isolation. Because if you put the dots together, as we've been talking about here, you realize that actually it's all one unfolding plan. And when you realize that, when the next excuse comes along to demonize another country, to regime change another government, instead of saying, oh, yeah, we've got to do this, you say, hold on a minute, I can see what's going on here. This is another excuse for the next stage of this plan. And so people, this hidden hand and its governmental front people lose their ability to dominate the narrative. And what has happened with the alternative media in recent years, not least in terms of the Middle East and what's come out, it's been exposed about the Western-funded white helmets and these other groups, has streetwised enormous numbers of people to the point where it's much more difficult to sell these things now than it was before. And this is why, because everything connects to everything else, this is why Facebook and Google and these other internet giants are now censoring and censoring and censoring alternative narratives. And of course, if you look at the background, Google, Facebook, it's owned by Israel. That's why Israel can say what it likes and never get censored. And Palestinian journalists, especially in more recent months, Palestinian journalists in great numbers are being deleted from these platforms. This is why YouTube is just deleting the YouTube channels of people that are putting another narrative to challenge the official one. All this is connected because in the end, control of an individual or control of a country or of a group or of a culture, of a religious faction, is by perception. You control people's perceptions of reality, perceptions of self, perceptions of world events, and thus you control their behavior. You control what they'll support and what they won't support, what they'll fight for, what they won't fight for, by their perception of that situation. And perception comes from information received. We form our perceptions of everything from the information we receive, whether it's a personal experience or whether it's the news networks, whatever it is, the schools that people go to. That's where our perceptions come from, our religions and that influence. And so, if you're going to control perception, you've got to control the information that people receive. And this hidden hand, I mean, a lot of people in the Middle East won't like this, but we've got to start talking honestly to each other or nothing's going to change. This hidden hand has no problem with Islam. No problem. Because they look at that as a belief system, a rigid belief system, at its most extreme anyway, that holds people in a perceptual servitude that is very limited. They have no problem with Judaism and Zionism, same. They have no problem with people that have fierce, rigid, immovable political belief systems. They don't care what belief system you have, really, so long as it's rigid and immovable. Because that means you're going to live your life in a tiny bubble of potential perception, thus potential understanding of what's going on. What terrifies them are people who start with a blank sheet of paper and say, what I believe and what I perceive about reality is going to go through my personal filter, and I'm going to decide what I find credible and not credible. And my belief systems are not coming from what the mainstream media tells me to have, not even what Al Jazeera tells me to have, not what my religious leaders tell me to have, not what my teachers tell me to have, not even what my parents tell me to have. I am going to decide what I believe based on what I choose to believe and what I choose to perceive of situations. That's what they're terrified of. Why? Because suddenly, instead of having a focus on a particular belief system, which is narrow in its breadth and depth, you're now in a situation of perceptual fluidity. You are willing, if the information and the evidence supports it, not to blindly believe anything, but to do so on the basis of what the evidence says to you. You have a fluid mind that will go where the evidence takes it. And when you do that, that's when the curtain opens. That is when the veil lifts. And that is when you see in the symbolic tale of the Wizard of Oz, that is when you see the wizard behind the curtain that you couldn't see before. Because that wizard takes many, many forms. It takes the form of every religious hierarchy, every political hierarchy, every banking hierarchy, every corporate hierarchy, every academic hierarchy, every scientific hierarchy in the mainstream is an expression of that wizard behind the curtain. And when that curtain opens, because your mind opens, that's when you realize that we have been living our lives under an extraordinary illusion, a gigantic hoax, which has been aimed to sell us different rigid belief systems with different names that can then be played off against other rigid belief systems under other names, so that the target human population is constantly at war with itself. And the tiny few, and my goodness, it's the tiny few compared with 7.5, 7.6 billion people currently. It allows the tiny few, what has now become known as the 1%, to run global events in every community without challenge, not least because the targets of that imposition have no idea where the imposition is coming from and the techniques of manipulation that it uses. And that's what I've dedicated my last 30 years of my life for, to open that curtain and say, hey, this is the real force of control in the world. It's not the people you think are in control. They're the puppets of that which is really in control. But if you take the American example currently, in Silicon Valley, you have the greatest concentration of surveillance and censorship power in human history that the world has ever seen. And you can break it down on one level to 5 people. The chairman and CEO of Facebook is Mark Zuckerberg, an Israeli supporting Zionist. The chief operating officer of Facebook is Sheryl Sandberg, a Israeli or Israel supporting Zionist. Google was co-founded with CIA seed funding, by the way, of the technology, by Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Israel supporting Zionists. They now head the parent company of Google, thus control Google, a company called Alphabet. YouTube, which is owned by Google, the chief executive officer is Susan Wojcicki, who is an Israeli supporting Zionist, and her sister, Anne Wojcicki, is a former wife of Sergey Brin. I think I mentioned earlier that when you break this down, the world gets very small indeed. Now, if you look at the power that Facebook has, Google has, and YouTube has, which is with all the channels it's deleting, to decide what people globally see and hear, the concentration of power is unbelievable and unprecedented. But there's more. These 5 people are hiring ultra-Zionist, revisionist Zionist, what I call hate groups, like the Anti-Defamation League in America and others in other countries, to advise them on what should be censored and what should be allowed for people to see. Now, just think about that. In a world of 7.5 billion, that handful of people has that global power to decide what you see and don't see. And what you see and don't see decides what? Your perception of reality overwhelmingly. Now, when I talk about the political vaudeville, the political sideshow, In America, they're not really talking about that, because half of America is, we hate Trump, he's a new Hitler, yeah, we go again. And the other half is supporting Trump, well, great numbers of them. There are many in between who aren't supporting either. They're the sensible ones. And so the anti-Trump faction and the pro-Trump faction are now played off against each other, and they're fighting each other and all the rest of it. And while that's going on, oh, pro-Trump, oh, I'm against Trump, pro-Trump, against Trump. In Northern California, in a tiny area of land comparatively called Silicon Valley, or the Devil's Playground as I call it, the world is being controlled. And every single day that control is getting fiercer and more centralized. That's what happens when we focus on the irrelevance instead of focusing on what we really need to focus on, which is what's happening in Silicon Valley, not least because also coming through Silicon Valley is the agenda to connect the human mind to technology and artificial intelligence, so that artificial intelligence becomes the human mind. And companies like Facebook and Google are at the forefront of that as well. And then go one step further back from the Zuckerbergs and the Brins and the Pages and the Googles and the Facebooks, and look who controls them. And what you find, and I document all this in my books, you find the National Security Agency, you find the CIA, and you find DARPA, the technological development arm of the Pentagon that seed funded the technology on which these corporations operate, which is owned by the Pentagon. So ultimately, people of the Middle East, when you go on Facebook, when you Google and all these things, YouTube, you're actually looking at assets of that which wants to destroy you and has worked now for so long to destroy you and your countries and to play you off against each other. So should we really be surprised that the assets of that force in the form of Facebook, YouTube and Google are now censoring what you're allowed to say? Of course not. It's all connected.
Is it fair to say that behind it all, the state of Israel is responsible for this global conspiracy?
Well, see, what Israel...
Because to us, it even seems like Israel controls the United States.
Well, this is how it works from my years of experience. Out of this population of 7.5 billion, the number of Jewish people in the world is about 16 million. I mean, a lot of people reel back at that. What's only 16 million? Yeah, and that's official figures from Jewish organizations. But of that 16 million, the vast majority don't want mayhem in the Middle East. Enormous numbers of them don't want the Palestinians to be treated as they are. And significant numbers not only don't support what Israel is doing, they vehemently challenge it. And they vehemently challenge Zionism, which they say has usurped their religion. So what you're looking at, and this is what we have to be very, very careful about, that we don't equate Jewish people as a group with ultra extreme revisionist Zionism. But, you know, I watched a documentary recently done by a Jewish man about it was called Defamation. You can see it on the internet. I do recommend it if people haven't seen it. And he showed two things, basically. One, the extraordinary indoctrination and programming that Jewish children and young people in Israel go through. It's incessant and it's merciless, and it sells them a view of the world and themselves that suits the revisionist Zionism agenda, which doesn't care any more about Jewish people, by the way, revisionist Zionism, than it does about anyone else. And the other thing, which is what I've been writing about for years, that this documentary showed, because the guy did well. He managed to get inside without them realizing what he was doing, of the Anti-Defamation League in America. And Abe Foxman was the leader for a long time. And he showed how there is a network which ultimately answers to Israel and revisionist Zionism of groups. The Anti-Defamation League is the most well known, but there are others in every country, in Britain, in Germany, etc., whose job it is to equate anyone who criticizes Israel, including Jewish people, actually especially Jewish people, with being anti-Semitic. And of course, I don't have to tell the word Semitic actually relates overwhelmingly to the Arabic peoples, which is a ridiculous.
لو سمحت ما تنساش تشترك في القناة ولايك للفيديو وشير علشان تشجعني أقدم لك معرفة أكتر ليك
and racism
شكرا.
To target, demonize and silence those that are challenging the Netanyahu regime and the networks that come out of that around the world, not least in America. And they target Jewish activists challenging the behavior of Israel even more fiercely than anyone else for this reason. It's very easy to dub those who are not Jewish anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel. They do try it bizarrely, but it's very much more difficult to dub Jewish people anti-Semitic, though, like I say, they do try. And what we have currently in my country, the United Kingdom, is a wonderful example of how this works. The opposition Labour Party in Britain, which is led by a man called Jeremy Corbyn, is currently under siege from these groups in Britain for being anti-Semitic. And the Labour Party has been suspending members for anti-Semitic statements, right? Many of these members are Jewish. So how can they be anti-Semitic? But it doesn't matter. The reason they are called anti-Semitic is they're calling out Israel, which is what it's really about. This Jeremy Corbyn is currently, as I speak, being again demonized for spending Passover with a Jewish group called Judas. And you'd think, well, he spent Passover with a Jewish group. Well, what's anti-Semitic about that? Well, this group, Judas, challenges Israel. And so it's not that you are anti-Jewish or pro-Jewish. It's that you are speaking to the wrong type of Jew, right? So if there's a right type of Jewish person, and you're still anti-Semitic if you deal with them, and they're anti-Semitic as well, and there is a good type of Jewish person, I'm talking from the perspective of this ultra-Zionist, revisionist Zionist agenda, then clearly it's nothing to do with being Jewish. Otherwise, you would be against both types, right? So the old definition, this is very important, the old definition of anti-Semitic was being anti-Jewish or hating Jewish people because they were Jewish. Now we have a process beyond that, which has gone beyond the definition of anti-Semitism as was into a new one. And this and new definition, which has come out in the last 2 years, equates criticism of Israel and criticism of Zionism with anti-Semitism. And why? Because they want to widen the definition of anti-Semitism so that they can silence criticism of Israel and exposure of these ultra-Zionist groups. Now, what this has done, this expansion of the definition, it's now taken in all those Jewish people who challenge Israel. And that's why we now have this situation where they're targeting Jewish people and calling them anti-Semitic when they're actually Jewish. It's because the definition has widened to, if you're Jewish and you are criticizing Israel and Zionism, then you too are anti-Semitic. Which leaves what? It leaves this group of extreme revisionist ultra-Zionists in a situation where they cannot be criticized even by Jewish people because it would be anti-Semitic to do so. This is where it's gone. And so, what I've just said alone exposes and blows out of the water this myth that these ultra-Zionist groups, answering in the end to Israel, are trying to protect Jewish people from racism. They're not, because they're targeting Jewish people and calling them racist for the crime of criticizing Israel. But then go one further. Who controls Israel? Because when you get into this, if you like, delving down the rabbit hole, you keep going. I mean, a lot of people in the alternative media, they go a bit in the rabbit hole and they stop and they say, oh yeah, this is what's going on. No, that's only one level of what's going on. You've got to keep going and never stop. And you keep going and you keep going. So you for instance say, okay, he's the president of the United States, right? Okay. But who controls him? And who controls them? Okay, Netanyahu is, and the regime is running Israel, okay? But who controls him? And who controls them? And in the end, and again, it goes deeper than this, you've got to look at the House of Rothschild. And what I find interesting and very, very relevant is that in this ever widening definition of anti-Semitism, they're now saying criticism of the Rothschilds is anti-Semitism, and claiming that the Rothschilds are involved in any manipulation of world events is anti-Semitism, even if Jewish people say that, when actually members of the Rothschild family over the years have said, yes, that's what's happened. I mean, the Rothschilds have been exposed in great detail by so much research, going back to from when they were created in Germany out of a Middle Ages occult family called the Bauers. They changed their name to Rothschild. They had a red shield, the six-pointed star, on their house in Frankfurt, and red star or red shield or red sign in German is Rothschild. So they call themselves Rothschild after that symbol, that Star of David, as it's called, which is not an exclusively Jewish symbol. It's been found all over the world. It's an esoteric occult symbol. So the documentation of the Rothschilds' involvement in manipulating world events by not least controlling the banking system and funding both sides in wars they engineer, and then when you've manipulated countries into a war and lent them money to fight the war, then you kind of own the country. And not only that, when the two countries have devastated each other, then you lend them more money to rebuild the countries they've devastated with your money, and you get them even deeper in debt, to the point where the Rothschilds and their networks own the country. So this is enormously well documented. But now they're saying criticism and exposure of the Rothschilds is also anti-Semitic. So you can see where this is going. Now, where I'm leading to in this is, if you do the research, and I have, and it's all there in earlier books, you find that the Rothschilds were absolutely the key players behind the creation of Israel, modern Israel. If you go back to the Balfour Declaration, when a British Foreign Secretary called Lord Arthur Balfour made a declaration in 1917 that the British Empire supported a Jewish homeland in Palestine, then you hear the word, the Balfour Declaration, and you get the impression that he stood up at some speech or in the Houses of Parliament and made this declaration. No. The Balfour Declaration in 1917 was a letter. And it was a letter to Lord Rothschild. That's what the Balfour Declaration was. A letter from this British Foreign Secretary to this Lord Rothschild, declaring that the British government, the British Empire, supported a homeland for Jewish people in what was then Palestine. Also, this Lord Rothschild had funded into existence in the latter part of the 19th century, the last few years, a secret society in Britain called the Round Table. The first head of the Round Table was a guy called Cecil Rhodes, who died in 1902, who plundered southern Africa, the diamond mines and the gold mines, for the Rothschilds, and created mayhem down there as they played tribe off against tribe. Again, same technique. So they divided and ruled each other, and the British Empire took over. Well, the Round Table had two levels. There was the outer circle that knew so much but not the big deal, and there was the inner circle that knew a heck of a lot more about what the Round Table was there for. Lord Arthur Balfour was an inner circle initiate of the Round Table Secret Society. Lord Rothschild was the funder and creator of the Round Table. And so the Balfour Declaration that started the process that led to the creation of Israel in 1948 was a letter from an inner circle initiate of a secret society to the funder and creator of that secret society. And by the way, that Round Table Secret Society from about 1920, 1921, began to create satellite organizations around the world, answering to it at the center. One of them that it created in 1921 through the Rockefeller family was called the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations from 1921 to this day has been one of the great drivers of American foreign policy. Another creation of the Round Table
لو سمحت ما تنساش تشترك في القناة ولايك للفيديو وشير علشان تشجعني أقدم لك معرفة أكتر ليك ولغيرك من المشاهدين.
Of bringing together people from all crucial aspects of society, politicians, corporate people, bankers, intelligence people, military people, journalists, etc., to develop a common policy and a common direction. Another creation of this roundtable secret society network that was involved in the Balfour Declaration was called the Trilateral Commission, another gathering group to manipulate and form common policies between, apparently in the public arena, unconnected people, organizations, and areas of society. The two people that created the Trilateral Commission were David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who we talked about earlier. So this is how the whole thing connects. Another satellite group of the Roundtable Network was called the Club of Rome, set up in the 1960s specifically to exploit the environment as an excuse to transform human society. From the Club of Rome has come the hoax of human-caused global warming, which is being justified to make so many changes in human society that would not otherwise be made. So this is how the connections operate. This is how they work. So after what happened in the Second World War in Nazi Germany, it was the Rothschilds that drove this movement of Jewish people out of Germany and into what was Palestine. And you know, this is an important point. The first Zionism conference was held in Basel, Switzerland, under the Rothschild control, was held in Basel, Switzerland in the latter years of the 19th century. I think it was 1897, something like that. The reason it was held in Basel, Switzerland, when it was supposed to have been held in Munich, Germany, is they had to move it out of Germany because of opposition from Jewish people in Germany to the goals of Zionism. They did not want to move to Israel. They were happy where they were in Germany. Thank you very much. But then something eventually happened in Germany, you might remember. And vast numbers of, in terms of ratio, of Jewish people then started to head for America and started to head for Israel. Under the auspices, and much of it under the funding of the House of Rothschild, who paid for the building of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, who paid for the building of the Supreme Court building in Israel, and who control Israel to this day. And
the House of Rothschild, though, are they Jewish or are they worshippers of Saturn?
These groups and these families that operate in this, what people call deep state now, but deep state's only one level, it goes deeper than that. They are what I would call Satanists. They are worshippers of the dark occult, because the word occult just means hidden. And there's enormous amounts of hidden knowledge, which would be enormous benefit to humanity if we understood it. It's one another area that I write about. But as with this microphone in front of me now, I can use that for good or I can use that for ill. And this deep esoteric knowledge about the true nature of reality, which is very different to the way we experience it, can be used to benefit humanity and set us free, or it can be used in this way by hoarding advanced knowledge of reality and how we interact with it and what this world is that we're actually experiencing. By hoarding that among a few secret societies and passing that knowledge on only through the upper levels of those secret societies and keeping the target population in total ignorance of that knowledge, you can use it clearly very effectively to control billions of people through their perceptions when they're actually comparatively a tiny few of you. So it's not the knowledge that's good or bad. It's just hidden, occult. It's the use of it. And these people use it mercilessly in very, very malevolent psychopathic ways. And so when the Rothschilds call themselves Jewish, they're not Judaism Jewish. Their Jewishness is the front. What they worship behind the front is very, very different. And when I say the Rothschilds, I'm not even talking about everyone called Rothschild. Again, the Rothschild family is compartmentalized. Great numbers of people who have Rothschild after their name won't have a clue what the inner circle of that dynasty is doing. And so, like I say, we have to stop seeing the world in black and white. Anyone who says it's the, and then gives you a name or a group or a people or a race or a religion has completely lost the plot. The truth doesn't lie in black and white. It lies in the shades of grey. It lies in the subtleness. Martin Luther King said that basically you shouldn't judge people by the colour of their skin, but the colour of their character. You shouldn't judge people because they call themselves Jewish or call themselves Islamic or call themselves Hindu or call themselves atheist. We're going to make judgments about people. It should be on the basis of individual behavior, not judging people because of the group they're part of or the belief system they're part of. There are some lovely, 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 lovely Jewish people, and there are some appalling Jewish people. There are some lovely, lovely Muslim people. There are some appalling Muslim people. There's some nice Christians. There's some appalling Christians. There's some nice atheists. There's some appalling atheists. Same with Hinduism. There's some lovely white people. There's some appalling white people. There's some lovely black people, some appalling black people. There are some lovely brown people. There's some appalling brown people. We need to look at people in and of themselves and look at individual behavior and put down this group judgment all the time, this racial judgment, this religious judgment, this all of them are the same judgment, because that is the very structure that allows groups to be played off against other groups and beliefs to be played off against other beliefs. And until that stops and we start looking at people as individuals, no matter what their color, creed, background, religion, or belief system, then the groups are going to be played off against the groups. Sunnis are going to be played off against the Shia, the right's going to be played off against the left, the transgender are going to be played off against the feminist, and so it's going to go on. We need to grow up as a human race and enter a realm of maturity where we start thinking for ourselves and perceiving for ourselves instead of downloading a programmed sense of everything from some external source, which is what education's about. What is education? It's a download of a belief system. That's what it is. What if you go to a Muslim school or a Jewish school or a Christian school and you start questioning the orthodoxy taught in those schools? Is the teacher going to say, oh, that's interesting, let's have a debate and a discussion, what Johnny's just said? No, it's shut up, I'm getting onto your parents this evening. And it's the same with education in general. It's not about opening the minds of young people. It's about closing them around a belief system, what I call the postage stamp consensus, a tiny sense of the potentially possible, which holds people in this perceptual prison all their lives. So we need to break out of that. You know, you may be a teacher, you may be an academic, you may be a religious leader, you may be a politician. But I'm not believing what you tell me if it doesn't feel right to me. If what you're telling me doesn't feel right to me, I'm going to feel and believe what I feel right, not what you tell me to believe. And then, you see, the whole control system, the whole hierarchy of control with all its levels starts to unravel, because it's held together by people of different religions, different backgrounds, different income brackets, different races, conforming to the perceptions of everything that we are given and told to believe in, or else. I chose 30 years ago. I chose 66 years ago. I'm just coming up to that birthday now. Not to do that, really, but really consciously.
لو سمحت ما تنساش تشترك في القناة ولايك للفيديو وشير علشان تشجعني أقدم لك معرفة أكتر ليك ولغيرك من
lies waiting for you beyond that perceptual prison cell wall, the postage stamp consensus. And you start to realize how you've been misled, how you've been hoaxed your entire life. And then the wizard behind the curtain starts to appear. And anyone can go through this process. You just got to let go of your belief system and see if it stands up to scrutiny. And if it does, fair enough, great. But at least put it under some scrutiny. Because if you don't, your belief is not your belief. It's what someone else in authority has told you to have. What are you, a software program? Or an expression of infinite awareness capable of free thought? That's the choice between freedom and fascism. And we better make it soon, because fascism is closing in very quickly.